Let's go to Gaza. You were there recently. You'd been there actually right after Cast led with Congressman Ellison. You went again. The humanitarian condition, has it changed at all?
Superficially, if you look at Gaza, you can see more traffic, you can see more products on the shelves, but here's what you don't see. You don't see very much rebuilding going on because you can't get basic building supplies in. So the houses that were destroyed are still destroyed. The schools that were destroyed are still destroyed. The water treatment plant, they've now drained the lake of sewage, but you can't get anything past just a settling pond because you can't get concrete in. On top of that, the commerce you do see is black market commerce coming in through the tunnels. So legitimate business is being stymied. UNRWA can't maintain, repair, and build the new schools it needs, so that they are doing double shifts, and there are a lot of kids who need to go to school who can't get in. And the key difference, a year ago you saw really battle shock, which as a psychologist I've seen elsewhere, that sort of vacant stare of people who've just been through hell. Now you're less likely to see that, but you're more likely to see kind of a chronic despair and depression of is anybody really seriously going to try to help us have an opportunity? And with 600,000 kids under the age of 14, children, wonderful, bright-faced, hopeful kids who ought to have every opportunity in the world, that's my biggest concern. What's their future look like?
I didn't do my degree work in psychology, but my PhD's in religion, and my postdoctoral was in anthropology. And the program I was in studied what happened to culture and religion under stress. And I think that's something that I worried about at the time, and I've worried about for the last 60 years of this situation. But this internalization of stress produces some deformities in the culture. The vacant stare that you're talking about, something else is going on there that I don't think we've accounted for yet.
Let me share with you a story that is very troubling to me. A psychologist who I met, we talked about, not surprisingly, the mental health impacts. He and his 7-year-old son were in their car, and the car in front got hit by a bomb or a missile, and everyone inside was killed and incinerated before their eyes. 7-year-old child witnesses this. A few weeks later, his son seems troubled, and he says, what's the trouble, son? And his 7-year-old son said, Dad, I want to be a suicide bomber. He asked why, and he said, because we're going to get killed anyway. Now, this was not a child educated in an extremist madrasa. He was not educated by an extremist system of schools to want that. He was educated by his experience of life, and he had every reason not to be. Imagine a parent hearing that from a 7-year-old child, and what does that communicate? They deserve better. We went to an UNRWA school with these wonderful young ladies, bright, articulate, studious, responsible. They just were striking young ladies, about 13 or 14-year-old girls. And yet you say they want to learn, they want to be educated, they want and deserve a brighter future. But as long as Gaza is blockaded, and you can't engage in real commerce, and you can't travel, even if you're sick, outside the confines, basically, what future do they have?
Yeah, sometimes I think we look at suicide bombing as a political issue and don't see it as the psychological issue that it is. It essentially means that young people want to kill themselves, and that there's a culture that celebrates it means that a culture of death has emerged, no hope in the future, and therefore strike out in the present. I guess I get especially troubled because an administration that I had hoped and thought, and from the president's own comments understood what the absence of hope means. And he applied it to Gaza, and yet they're now stuck on negotiations and not dealing with the day-to-day trauma and how to deal with that, as if that has to wait for negotiations to happen, and it really doesn't.
No, it doesn't. You know, a year ago, just 3 weeks or so after the bombing had stopped, we met Palestinians who were naming their children Barack Obama. And there was real hope. And President Obama, I believe his heart and mind are in the absolute right place. And to their credit, the U.S. aid has gotten computers in. We are funding UNRWA. We're the greatest donors of UNRWA in the world right now. I'm concerned the Canadians are pulling back some. So to the administration's credit, it has done some very positive things. At the same time, the early insistence that aid get in, it's being blocked on a daily basis by the Israelis. the early insistence that settlements stop. Netanyahu basically said they're going to continue, you know, and he's done this sleight of hand about whether they are or not. And there's now this despondency about, we had so much hope. The time is ticking. This president speaks and spoke about the audacity of hope and the fierce urgency of now. We must not forget that fierce urgency.
If you want to join the conversation, give us a call from overseas. The number is 001-202-842-5056. If you're calling from here in the U.S., it's 1-800-528-2090. The president called, I think it was on his third day in office, second day actually. He appointed George Mitchell, and he called for an end to the blockade. It hasn't happened. You've made some proposals following this most recent visit to do an airlift, to bring a ship to the shore and roll off supplies. Has the White House responded to that?
We've communicated it to him, no formal response. The premise for me is this, you know, when the Berlin airlift happened, basically roads were closed, rail systems were closed, and we just said we're not going to leave this place imprisoned by the East Germans. And we brought supplies to those people for a year until we broke the blockade. We, in the case of Gaza, our Secretary of State and Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate have had to be relegated almost to pleading for, can macaroni get in? How about garbanzo beans? What about toothpaste? Nuts to that. Nuts to that. It's time to say, people are in need, and let's get material to rebuild schools, hospitals, housing, wastewater treatment. If we bring it in on U.S. ships, it's certainly not going to have hidden missiles.
The Israeli response to your proposal was, would he have called for a Berlin airlift if the Nazis were running Berlin? Is UNRWA? In other words, does the airlift have to go to Hamas, or is the United Nations or other NGOs, are they in a position to be on the receiving end and the administrative end?
No question about it in my mind, and I've spoken with UNRWA officials who assure us that they could take the material off a roll-on, roll-off ship, put it in their controlled warehouses, designate exactly where every pound of cement would go, where every bar of rebar would go, every piece of glass, and begin building their schools and rebuilding hospitals. What's happening now, if you want to repair Al-Quds Hospital, how do you do it? The hospital was burned by Israeli bombing. Well, you're going to have to buy concrete at exorbitant prices through the black market. Well, that's not how we should rebuild our hospitals.